Everyone. Am I audible? Right. I'm pleased to welcome you to our final panel of the day, titled In the Realm of the Sonic Senses, which is programmed as a part of the exhibition A Haptic Score, taking place at the old GMC building on the first floor and is curated by Virangna Solanki. Virangna is an independent curator and writer based in India. She's interested in the way interdisciplinary forms and creative practices merge to create dialogues in public and private spaces and the convergence of images across disciplines. We're very pleased to have with us Paul Purgis, Vishwa Shroff, Nishant Shukla, and Ritu Satar on the panel. Paul Purgis is a London based artist and musician working with sound performance and installation. Vishwa Shroff's artistic practice is firmly rooted in drawing with a proclivity towards architectural forms that serve as compelling takeoff points for a deeper contemplation on memory and our relationship with the material world. Nishant Shukla's practice spans photography, filmmaking, and sound art. His recent work delves into experimental spatialized sound, crafting multisensory responsive installations through collaborative processes. Ritu Satar is a performance-based artist and filmmaker based in Dhaka, Bangladesh. Her practice questions human perception and imperceptible nature of re-examining history and creating knowledge. This panel is moderated by Gautam Pemaraju. Gautam is a Mumbai-based writer and filmmaker working in history, literature and art with special interests in early 20th century Indian anti-colonialism, the cultural history of Hyderabad and the Deccan, and sonic cultures, sound art, and aesthetics. I'm going to invite Virangna to introduce the exhibition and then we will go into the panel.
Thank you, Misha. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here at the end of probably what's been a very long and tiring day for all of you. I'm just going to briefly introduce how I arrived at A Haptic Score. In 2020, when Serendipity invited me to curate an exhibition, the pandemic hit. And we had to think about how we were going to move into an online version of it, which is how Future Landing came about. And with Future Landing, one of the things that we didn't want is about how we would go back to a static website. So this idea of this loss of control, which is something that all of us were facing every day pretty much, came back into the exhibition itself, which was online, and how it was constantly changing. And after 2 years of Future Landing, something which we never thought would become a physical form, it was a reverse challenge to how do you make something virtual that's constantly changing and into a physical form, which is how we arrived at Future Landing in 2022. Something that emerged with Future Landing was just how the senses work and what it might mean to experience the same work by different individuals at the same time. And sound became quite prominent, the image became quite prominent in that, and I started thinking about synesthesia, which led to synesthetic notations last year. With synesthetic notations, a part of what remained unresolved for me has led to a haptic score, which is the idea of touch and how touch is an underlying form of every form of how we feel, how we create memories, how sound hits us. And with all the artists who are part of A Haptic Score, all 15 of them, there was sound, of course, which is prominent, but also how does touch return and how it becomes a form of experience, which then become individual memories. This is something that Gautam and I were speaking about earlier, and I'm going to let Gautam take it from here with the artists on the panel. Many of the artists also present here in the room, so maybe later on. Yeah. Thank you, Gautam.
Thanks. Thanks, Virangana. It's great to be here, and thanks to the artists and all of you here gathered here. Thanks, of course, firstly to Nandita Jaishankar and to Serendipity inviting me here to moderate this panel. I was in Kolkata a few days ago, and I had the opportunity to meet a friend of mine, a computational linguist and a speech sciences professor at Jadavpur University. And we got talking about several things. And he mentioned two very interesting modes of experimentation, one of which he's, I think, marginally involved with, but knows of. And I'm just going to introduce the idea to you here. And I'm quoting directly from the abstract of one of the experiments. So these two scientists, Brian Gick and Donald Derrick, take a puff of air as the starting point for a study of whether the sense of touch can contribute to what we hear. They applied small inaudible air puffs to the skin of volunteers who were simultaneously listening to a series of consonant sounds. Air puffs aimed at either the hand or neck made it more likely that aspirated sounds would be heard. So the B was misheard as P, following an air puff. This work could prove useful to the future development of audio and telecommunication aids for the hearing impaired. Now, one of the takeaways from this is that the application of a puff of hair on the side of a neck changes our perception of the consonant itself. That's really quite fascinating to my mind and underscoring one of the aspects of a haptic score. And secondly, there's another very interesting phenomena called the Kiki Booba effect, a non-arbitrary mental association between speech and shapes, wherein people uniformly, wherever it was tested across the world, people uniformly link nonsense words to certain shapes. So in this case, Kiki was a spiked shape and Booba was a rounded shape. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the McGurk effect, which is quite common, and there's a very wonderful video which demonstrates this effect, which is an auditory visual illusion, a perceptual phenomena wherein an illusory sound is created when the brain combines visual and auditory information. Now, I bring all of this up in relation to the show where the four of these artists and many others, and a total of 15 whose work is on show, curated by Virangana, in what is really a really wonderful, very thoughtful collection of works. So firstly, congratulations to Virangana for that. Titled Haptic Score, of course. Now, the intersections between speech, non-speech, sound, bodies, touch, multisensory perception, spaces, dimension, materials, interactivity is an intriguing, fecund imaginarium that underscores, so to speak, the 16 works that are on show. From memory making, memorialization, identity, the materiality and the immateriality of sonic artifacts and objects, psychic spaces animated by stimuli and sensing, gestures, movements, and performative acts in space, and the gentle frictions of meaning and its absence in speech acts, synesthetic intersections and slippages, semantics, cognitive meaning and the loss of cognitive meaning in speech and non-speech acts, and the political heft of recorded artifacts and their deployment in the public realm, in the public sphere. The archive as an artistic source, device, and artifact simultaneously, not to mention the transcendental experiences and implications. There is indeed a very wide range of provocations that we take away from this show. I would now like to show a very short video excerpt, a clip, which underscores and some of these things that we are discussing today. Go ahead, you can play the video.
If I really want to listen to everything, then I have to stop speaking, stop thinking as far as possible, and then I can scan in more detail across the whole field of sound.
That's it. Thank you. Okay, I'd like to start with Ritu. Now, you have a 5-channel display, right? And we were talking 6-channel display. Could you talk to us? Could you very briefly describe the work to the audience here? And could you talk about the intersection between the image and the sound heard in the gallery space?
Well, I'm not a big fan of talking about my work, especially in a panel. It's the most difficult thing to do, although I have acted on stage like 17 years, but that means like you are actually saying some dialogues. You were never actually speaking your mind. But now I actually reached to this work because I'm really interested into how the system made a proportion of people invisible. How we have made a world where actually there are such strong borders that that there will be people, their senses, their lives, their existence, their very existence, it gets totally invisible. So I think for me, I'm always trying to connect these imperatives by bringing sound, sometimes film or images, moving images. And I'm always thinking that I'm walking on a stage maybe, or the audiences or the visitors, they're actually the actors who are whenever they're experiencing my work, actually the main work happens then by their perception of the work. So I really don't have anything to say between the relationship of the visuals and the sound. I'll just say that I wanted to bring some accompaniments from Indian classical music and and also our lifestyle, and to take this sound as a representation of lives who are like just considered as accompaniments to our big stairs to step on.
Could you talk about the images on the 6 monitors? They're different forms. They're almost like micro performative acts. Could you tell us about that?
I think I was in this particular work, I will say, because I'm a very, very confused artist who always goes back and forth, and edit a lot. But I think in this particular work, I was super focused. And I sort of thought that I will bring those sound and those bodies and those practicing artists who are invisible and minorities in their own practices as well, like the Indian classical musicians. And and then again, when I need to pronounce this kind of territorial words, like if I want to say the classical music, I have to say Indian classical music. So so the kind of senses I even grew up don't really belong to me even. So these blurry lines and these complexities I wanted to bring, like in sort of wanted to deal it with the parts of bodies, like keeping the bodies anonymous, and very easy, and also use the sounds what are like considered as just accompaniments in the Indian classical music. Yeah.
Okay, great. Vishwa, now the first thing that strikes one looking at your work in space is that there is a very strong aspect of memorialization that you're in the one sense that you're recreating something, but in the other sense you're kind of building this kind of construct, this kind of space of memory. Could you talk a little bit about the location of the location relevant to your work, and what personal attachment you have to it and the work itself?
So my overall practice has been kind of about looking at architecture and what our bodies, and up until very recently just our bodies and head and eye movements and things like this. Since last year, I also started to think about other senses, and these other senses that are both, they trigger memory. Also, I should give a little bit of a background. My mother is an excellent narrator, and there is a kind of methodology of telling a story which creates myths, like family myths, very personal family myths. So coming to the site, 13 Post Office Lane, Kalba Devi, used to be my grandparents' house, which we lost access to that house in the sense that the house was sold about 30 years ago. So, and I was 9 at the time, so I don't have a physical memory of that space anymore. Nonetheless, through conversations with people who lived in that house before 1980 or 89, we kind of memory mapped what they remembered hearing, which I also feel are not uncommon sounds. Like, they're fairly common sounds. They're in your house, and they're in her house, and they're in my house. And yet they become specific because they are attached to a particular building that I'm telling you it is. So there is also that myth of the space, or the family home that becomes this kind of temple of your ancestry, which is kind of what I've been thinking of with this one.
Okay, and you use a narrative device for the soundtrack itself. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I love radio plays. So that's kind of what I was also referring to in making of this. My collaborator, Rajesh Hirji, who also happens to be my cousin and a person who grew up in that house, he is a radio, television recording artist. And so it kind of, the format made sense to make it into a very common way of understanding a narration that is not necessarily true. So there's a kind of fictionalization or myth making within these sounds, which I find very interesting.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Moving on, Paul. Now, we have. I'm yet to see the work, of course.
I think we can talk in the abstract.
Yeah, we talk in the abstract.
Late to the party as usual.
Yeah, but we did have a conversation.
Yeah.
Yes. So there are several things that I took away from the conversation that we had. One, of course, is the relationship between patterns and musical scores, and the historical sense of the intersection, the relationship between these. So could you talk about your practice and what you're installing at the moment?
Yeah, well, actually, it's a lot of the my background is as an architect originally, and then got involved in electronic music, and then artistic research and art making, and I think at the core of that, like, music was the foundation for me in terms of actually into like connecting with culture in any form. So actually, when the premise of the haptic score was put forward, it was actually incredibly exciting because it was a chance to take a lot of the large-scale installation projects that I've been doing that were very architecturally informed, very sonic, but actually lacked that quality of the tactile, which is a thing that is, to me, a particularly special sense of the generosity of interactivity. You know, thinking back art historically about how much has been taken away from the audience potential in terms of defining an artwork, and actually the opportunity to kind of reinstill, to rethink about that hierarchy, that relationship, and actually doing it through the language of sound, space, and music felt really natural. It made a lot of sense. And so within that, the defining of, let's say, visual language for it definitely felt like it corresponded with the histories of, let's say, visual music, graphical scoring, I guess like circular scoring as well, the sense of almost like a mandala-like way of writing music in a non-linear format as well. So I think it was a way to try and build a bridge between all these disparate elements of interest and research, and to combine it into a singular, let's say, experience that created that, let's say, was in a dialogue with that history of, 20th century kind of modern conceptual music of indeterminacy, about things being kind of unscripted, unscored. So I think it was just an opportunity to think about the tactile, think about the scoring, think about the space in which artworks aren't singularly authored. They might be collectively made. It might be a sense of everybody arriving and creating a very different experience and taking something very different from it. So it's an opportunity, I think, to just explore that space and think also in terms of the, I guess, like the sense of symbolism and meaning within various forms of pattern and geometry and, let's say, layering of forms and movement that, to me correspond to both modernist histories but ancient histories, and a sense both within, let's say, architecture, design, music, dance, the sense where actually there's a really fascinating fluidity of the temporal. Things can be contemporary and they can be historical, but they can kind of move and shift between that space. And I think symbols and geometry obviously have a capacity to be very fluid in that shaping of meaning.
You also spoke about interactivity. You've mentioned it now. And so to what extent, I think you said that you had not done interactive works before, if I'm not mistaken, or have you? Sorry.
No, I haven't. And actually, I feel like I've been a snob, personally. Right. I've been kind of entrapped in this idea of thinking that, like, artworks need to be authored, and experienced. And I think the more I've looked into, I guess like going back to the late 1960s, early 70s, a lot of kind of experiments were happening in technology and experimental media during that window. I've done a lot of research into the New York Group Experiments in Art and Technology, EAT, that actually developed an outpost in India, which was quite interesting, but another story. But that goes back to see a lot of these kind of artists, like people like Robert Rauschenberg or something, we think of them as kind of art makers, but really, really indebted in exploring interactive artworks. So I think that somehow something kind of got lost in the sense of making, the sense of shaping experiences. And I think actually it's a very enriching sense for the public. You know, a lot of people don't know about art history or whatever the baggage that we take to making, to kind of museum visiting or whatever. But actually I think what's great about sound and music is it's very good at bypassing that. People can have an experience on their own terms. It's very honest in that sense. And I think I like that politic. And likewise, I think interactivity has a similar sense where actually everyone's like having their own experience and taking their own thing from it, and everyone's defining their own access and meaning from it. And I think that that's like philosophically like actually quite an exciting way of making work.
Okay, thank you. Part of what Paul says, you know, it leads me to Nishant. You mentioned in the conversation with me and in your artistic notes the idea of a transcendental element to perhaps the experience of the work in the space, and there are several components to your work. I mean, there's a interactive component, of course, there's a visual element, images, and there's sound. So I mean, and it's linked to anonymous location, and could you briefly talk about the elements, and also associatedly you spoke about the idea of game as works being seen as games because of interactivity, and is there a fine line that you have been thinking about while making this work? Yeah. No, I think you just press the button at.
I got it.
Yeah.
It's coming. I should know how to do that. I mean, I'll speak to the whole transcendental.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is a sense of like seeking completion in our experience of life. I think we're kind of navigating life, be it an artist or be it like, you know, anybody really. And I think that's really what keeps people going. And I think this idea of like chasing something, like chasing an outcome, whether it is like doing this installation here or like being able to create an experience that speaks to people in the way that you'd like, or communicate ideas that pretty complex, I suppose. And I think artworks that I have been making, mostly photographic works, I felt that they never really communicated the idea that I was, you know, that was important to me, and I was like a bit disillusioned by that. So I felt like I needed to stop making work till I figured out like how can I actually create a interaction in which the audience doesn't need to be like explained. Like I want to leave them with a feeling, a sense of a perception of something which is connected to the work. I want them to go home and lie in bed and wonder what they saw and trigger something. And because end of the day, I think all of us here, like all artists, are like wanting to communicate something, wanting to like express something. And I feel like, personally speaking, like my own work, like I felt didn't do what I wanted it to do. It did something, you know, but it wasn't doing what I wanted it to do. So I think in the last few years, sound became a very kind of important way to, like a route to explore, because I feel like photography for me, even though I know I have my photographic friends in the audience, so please don't hate me for saying this, I felt like wasn't really, like it's a really hard medium to access. I mean, the ideas that I wanted to talk about like, I don't think like people connected to them. They needed explanation. They needed a conversation. And like Paul was saying earlier, like sound, music, cinema, literature doesn't need that sort of training or exposure to be able to access it. And so I wanted to like explore sound as a way of and incorporating that into my work. So the work is actually something quite old. Like I made it in 2011, 2016, and it was a photo book that was published by Gauzy Foundation of the Arts. And I'm still working with the same material because I'm trying to figure out like how do I communicate. I'm still trying, you know, like I feel like there's lots more work to do. And so sound, film, I think the responsive nature of it, I did a bunch of tests along the way and realized that playing like composed pieces wasn't still doing that. And how do you involve the audience or compel them even to like really get into the shoes of the artist or experience like maybe how painful it is to be, you know, to make that work or potentially even be like one of the people in my work, like, you know, people featured in my work are like, it's a painful process to like seek transcendence and not really find it, and it's like it's painful. And the same thing is like, you know, artists making this work, it's like it's a painful process and we never really talk about it. So I suppose the experience is kind of centered around, well, attempting to maybe disorient people and disturb them a bit. I don't know if it's successful in that, but I mean, I'm suddenly shaking by being in my room and listening to it. So, or maybe it's just fatigue. but yeah, that's the attempt to really kind of move people. And I think like all the mediums and all the technology behind all of that, like they're largely invisible. And I don't like, it's just a learning curve. So I feel like I'm a baby, like in this whole kind of world of sound. Like 2 years ago, I would like, you know, I was hoping to do something like this. And I, you know, when people told me there are people out there like doing stuff like this, I thought that's cool. I'd like to do that one day. So that's just 2 years ago, you know. So, I mean, I'm very privileged to be sat here amongst, you know, yeah, so.
Thank you. A general question for all of you. I mean, Virangana mentioned and underscored the synesthetic experiences, and of course, you know, there's so much complexity to the world of synesthesia. Starting with you, Ritu, I mean, we use expressions like the color of sound or the taste of something else, and we mix these senses in complex kind of ways. Have you ever kind of like, has your work ever sort of grappled with these kinds of connections between the senses?
Well, I live in Dhaka, so so you know, there was a day just I think 5-6 months back. I was sitting recording and also scolding myself that why am I recording but not sensing it. But you know, my artist thing just, you know, and then I started recording it. But I'm like sitting in a CNG, so the CNG is also like, and I am, you know, I will never forget this experience. so you know, so I think through my work, I always want people to touch to that core. Of course, I fail, and then I keep on doing it. And for me, I'm also like a baby. I'm always exploring new things that I never did. And only, as I've said, like, you know, I'm always confused. I'm editing, I start I start to shoot something, I don't know what will happen to it. I record a sound, I never know where am I going to use it. And then I sit to edit, and then, it's all actually the sense. And I really believe that like as an artist, my practice is based on senses, I would say. And if I fail to touch other people's sense, then, maybe the next work will.
Vishwa? So,
Sorry,
so the same question. Okay,
I
okay.
was very mesmerized by her.
So broadly, just since Virangana brought up synesthesia and these kinds, do you have you grappled with those kinds of cross connections between the senses and the in your work?
I mean, since we are all pretty infantile at this, I will take the claim of being the youngest of them still, since I started thinking about it only last year. And for me, the narration, this idea of narration or story within art has been quite important. And a lot of it, of course, I'm looking at architecture and how they become repositories for the most part, but the idea of narration, the idea of storytelling or particular methodologies of stories have been very like a fundamental interest. And story void of, because I also listen to a lot of radio drama, a lot of podcasts, a lot of kind of audio books and all of this. The story void of visuals allow for those visuals to form. But then for me also there is a question of what happens if there is a still image, not a moving image. Because you see a lot of pairing within cinema, within television, all of these popular media, so to call, of moving image and sound. But what about if there is a still image and sound? So you still have a particular reference. You have a particular location, you have a particular address, so to speak, that you're pinning it to. And yet the image itself is not explanatory in any way to the sound. That's where I'm at, I think.
Okay, arguably, like in your work, for instance, could one, I mean, this is posing a question, in the description, in the narrative description of the events of the boy narrator and the sounds and the images, could one possibly smell the environment?
Oh, I do hope so. I do hope so. I also hope that the movement is felt of kind of going up and down, and the sensation of, or those vibrations that the body experiences, say while going up a staircase, or the act of going from opening a window, or having a smoke after opening a window, or even that moment of kind of ignoring something and running to open the window because you cannot bear another minute without a smoke. Those, I hope they are felt. I'm not sure if they are. I'm not sure if this radio drama format necessarily allows that. So in contradiction to what Paul was saying, it is very, very authored. It's very kind of contrived in that sense. It's not left it's not left to interaction as such. It's kind of firmly held somewhere. So I'm not sure that it does that yet, but sure, there is an ambition to perhaps explore that.
Thank you. Paul, along the same lines, often we experience these slippages between the senses, like there are these liminal spaces. We begin with something, we begin with like a invocation, a sonic invocation, or a piece of music or something, and then some kind of a embodied sense overtakes us. In relation to your work, could you talk about that?
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about this idea of synesthesia, because it's obviously something I'm aware of, but I've never stopped to kind of deconstruct it in relationship to the kind of exhibitions I've done. But actually, as I'm sitting in this room thinking through, it's definitely something like it's definitely been like a method or a kind of principle that has been kind of going on underneath the surface. Because I think I've definitely been interested in bringing together, let's say, color systems, architectural design methods, geometries, light, smells, sound, and actually thinking about how you can kind of cross-wire these semiotics, these kind of relationships between seeing colors whilst hearing sounds, whilst smelling, whilst seeing light. You know, the sense we're actually like cross-wiring the senses. And I think actually within that, sound is like an amazing glue somehow that can bond kind of like matter, light, smell, touch together into it's somehow like a gel that somehow very elegantly can bridge kind of the material and the immaterial together. So actually, I'm going to say yes in answer to this question. I do explore ideas of synesthesia, not necessarily formally like thinking through it as a synesthetic act or kind of methodology, but I think actually like thinking how the senses talk to each other within a space, and also to think through how kind of time also becomes a kind of factor in shaping these kind of like shifting possibilities through particularly light, but also sound duration. I think that there's a kind of dynamic that happens between that is really exciting.
Just before moving on to Nishant, something that came up in your answers just earlier is suggested, although you didn't explicitly say it, was the hierarchical relationship between the visual and the auditory. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, well, I think anyone that's experienced like the world of the visual arts knows that very, very little attention has been paid to the sonic, I think, over the last 30 years. And I think a lot of effort has been made to rethink about the way that art is structured in order to kind of monetize and add value to two-dimensional objects placed on walls. And I think that's come at the expense of a lot of other possibilities, a lot of other futures that we could be living in now. So in some sense that there is a kind of politic to thinking about actually positioning artistic acts and artistic languages outside of the visual. And also I think once again, I think I mentioned this earlier, is like there's a kind of freedom of access to it. And I think that things can be highly conceptual, but also very, very easily immersed into. And I think that's a really, really powerful thing, especially at a time when actually, for monetary reasons, I'm talking from a UK position here, but less and less people are even going to have the resources to go to an art school, to have an arts education. The nature of what we think art is going to be within the public realm, we're already looking at major museums like Tate or whatever, and they're already thinking about like, oh, actually, how do we access these young audiences that aren't even probably interested in art, right? So actually, I think that there has to be like other languages, other methods, other principles, other ways, and I think art is really going to probably evolve, I think, as art fairs die, because there's less and less money in them. Everyone's panicking, or the art market's shrinking. So I think that actually, in a way, art is a fluid possibility, and I think by thinking beyond the visual, that does create another kind of frontier, another space that we can look to.
Nishant? Along the same lines, there are many different components to your work, but broadly, in general, synesthesia, I mean, we encounter it in daily life even. In relation to your work, have you had to sort of grapple with it in terms of making work?
I mean, I think that's happening on automatic because I'm engaging sound, visuals, maybe a sense of touch, but in the denial of being able to touch things that are in the room. I think it's this idea of like a sound, like generating something that's like another, like it's triggering another sense. I think I'm doing it from a perspective of like trying to trigger some new synapses in the brain, trying to get people to think outside of that traditional kind of expectation of what you're meant to experience. And I think that can only happen if you're like give enough stimulation, and so, but also like a balance of that so you don't overstimulate. And so, I don't know, I saw some like very interesting pieces of art and work where I felt like I was receiving some information, like with sound and visual. As a Roji Aikida show at like in London at a place I can't remember. It was a really grand show, and I remember going to watch it twice because there was the sound and the visual of this experience felt like you're receiving some like alien information like that you can't decipher, but you're downloading it, and now suddenly you become a superhero. And so there is that excitement when that sort of thing happens. And
do you think that kind of, especially in Roji Ikeda's work, that kind of those kind of very grand kind of shows, that iterative aspect of the sonic and the visual impulses, does that affect our bodies and our minds in the sense that it moves us into that kind of transcendental thing that you've alluded to earlier?
Yeah, I mean, even the video you showed, like this practice in like spiritual practice has a lot of sound and, text. And I don't think the visual part is that strong in the spiritual context. And so I think that's always been used as a way to trigger or, access some sort of portal that, if for lack of a better word, like to be able to, I don't know, go to a new place. And I think it does, sound is probably more powerful in that sense.
Cool.
I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
You did. Thank you. I actually have a question for Virangana. In your curatorial note, I mean, you mentioned, if I'm not mistaken, beyond the conventional synesthetic impulses that things that happen to us, that are you suggesting like the liminal spaces between the senses?
I think the liminal spaces between the senses comes about with a discovery of yourself. For instance, just the first work, which is Alan's work, when you walk in, you think you're walking into space, and very often you walk into art shows thinking you're just going to be looking and we other what you're going to be looking at, because we go in thinking it'll be something we see and come out. But what ends up happening is you, for instance, again, coming back to Alan's work, you go in and you just suddenly feel like you need to recalibrate your body because of your balance. And similarly with everybody's work in different ways, you return to yourself, and by returning to yourself, you start rethinking these spaces where I think that space of the liminal space between the senses comes in, because then you're suddenly rethinking what you're feeling, you're rethinking the sense that's being activated, and there's a pause when you're not ready for it.
Before, maybe we can open up for questions, but before we do so, actually I also had a question for Shuddho, if I may. Shuddho, in the work that you guys installed, there's this sense of monumentalism, right, with the image at the back, the large image, and the structure and the object in the middle of the room, and of course, the visual itself is extremely striking. Any number of kind of illusions, metaphoric illusions, can be drawn from the imagery, the visual imagery. But the sound, in some sense, is disparate, but it is conveying something. There's some kind of intersectional relationship between the three elements in the space. But I took away the sense of monumentalism from the work. Could you just talk about that in relation to the curator's intervention?
Thanks. Sure. I wasn't prepared to answer anything, but I'll try. I think the work is called Parallel Exercises for Eyes, Ears, and Feet. And the image that you're calling monumental is a series of airplanes, commercial airplanes sinking into the sand of the Mojave Desert on the one day when it flowers, which in a sense points to two things. Deserts shouldn't be places where flowers blossom. Planes should be in the sky, not sinking into the ground. So these are paradoxes in a way, if you like, and I think that we found Virangana's prompt to be a trigger for thinking about paradoxes as things cross across the senses. The spoken word pieces, which are very they're discrete, you have to get to them before they can get to you, are about the difference between hearing and understanding, and about something catastrophic that must have happened, but the person who's speaking didn't hear it. She wasn't there. So this idea of that there are things happening in the world constantly that challenge our sensory integrity, if I may say so, and we have to recalibrate our senses constantly. And the carpet that is between themselves is like the printout of an ECG machine. It sort of indexes palpitations of the heart. So you get the heart, you get the ears, and you get the eyes, and they're all telling you different stories. But the body that's kind of cohering them is trying to make one story out of them, but it doesn't know if it is hearing what it's understanding or understanding what it's hearing. So I guess between the catastrophe of the aircraft falling from the sky and sinking into the desert and the banality of a voice saying that I was just going for getting ready for my tuition class, or I was at the swimming pool, but was I hearing what I was understanding? I think that's what it's trying. That's how we sort of read Virangana's prompt as permission for us to do. That's all.
Thank you. Very interesting. Before I open up to the audience for questions, I want to mention as a last thought, and maybe just leave it to you guys for quick responses. One of the most commonly reported auditory illusions is a sleep-based illusion. When people report when they're either falling into sleep or coming out of sleep, they either hear the sound of a doorbell or their name being called. So do any of you have any ideas or thoughts on auditory illusions?
Very interestingly, this morning, I was here listening to Ghulam Sheikh talk about Bhupen Khakkar. And it seems Bhupen Khakkar, in his own kind of dual situation between being homosexual and not being able to bring this out, he develops a system for himself where he creates myths of himself to narrate to others. And there is a multiplicity of these myths that he creates. So every time he is introducing himself, it seems that every time he introduces himself, he's a different. So he's still Bhupen Khakkar, but it comes with a different story. One of which was narrated this morning is that he creates these back lives for himself, so that he's a butterfly and I find that those kind of stories that we create for ourselves, or myths that we create of ourselves, or sit in that dream space, because they're not necessarily lies, but they're not the truth, or they're not factual either. And that to me is this moment of kind of going, oh, I heard something and I'm unsure. The other one, which is very commonly reported, is hearing a bang in your sleep, and you're not quite sure if you actually heard it. And I feel that these kind of self-narrations or self-introductions that we create, or the stories we tell about ourselves, follow that kind of half sensory experiences, which is perhaps something I'd like to look at some point.
Any thoughts?
I think I have a performance. I did, and the performance was sort of like when I was performing, I was actually thinking, like, what are the sounds in my memories? So it was like 8-hour performance while I was spinning, and so for 8 hours while I am spinning, so my physically I'm involved in something else, and mentally I'm thinking like, what are the sounds that I can make, and but the sound I won't think, that will just come out of my memory. And very interestingly, my voice was making sound of azans. It's really interesting. It's not related to sleep, as I have said, like, that we live in many kinds of sensory levels in our lives, and sometimes we actually do not know what remains deep inside your empty cells. Huh? And this is like one of the experience that I that gave me this, how to say it, like, to look at sound in a very different way, to look at the way I actually sort of take or approach sound in my works, I'll say. Yeah.
I'm going to be quick on this. I guess, like, actually, from a technical point of view, actually from a compositional point of view, one of the things that's actually always been very interesting is thinking about this duality, the sensory duality, is actually when acoustic instruments end up sounding synthetic or electronic, and vice versa, where electronic starts to sound acoustic. So I think that space is, personally, I love that. I love that kind of slipperiness that occurs, and sometimes through like certain kind of like stringed instruments, or even the Chennai, like certain tonalities just sound really electronic. So I think from a compositional point of view, I think on those terms, but actually just thinking in the sense of the waking up, the kind of slip between the conscious, the subconscious, and the way the sonic kind of interconnects with that. I've never seen a ghost, thankfully, but I have heard 3 now across my life. So one of them is actually verified by somebody that, oh, this is the whistling ghost that's famous in this pub. So I think actually I think that this is the problem where you overdevelop one sense, is I think you just grow that channel a little bit too much. So yeah, so hopefully I won't hear a 4th before I leave Goa. No, none in Goa yet, but I think it might be waiting for me. I've got a few more days left.
I mean, I always think that, like, I've been thinking about, like, contemplating the last few years of my life, and I feel like that's constantly been, like, I've been in a sleeping state, and so I feel like, yeah, like, I don't know, like, I think there's there's a sense of, like, oh, I need to be woken up, and I feel like everybody needs to be, like, woken up and shook a little bit, and I feel so I don't really I've never really considered, like, the sound of, like, what wakes you up, but there is yeah, I think the attempt or the idea of, like, I to be honest, I'm feeling a bit sleepy, so I'm losing I'm starting to fall asleep at this conversation of sleep, so I'm, like, losing my train of thought. I had something to say, but I've forgotten it now. But I'll come back to it. Yeah.
So how about we open it up to the audience if anyone has questions for the
Okay, it's not really a question, and some technology is doing something here. Yeah, maybe. I have to hold this quite far. It's like, is it George Michael or Streisand? It's fine. So, well, I guess one of the things that struck me.
Go to a different position. Yeah. Move across the room. Maybe come here. Yeah. Just move over here.
It's okay. I'll go without. Oh, I'll just hold it, George Michael. So one of the things that did strike me, and maybe Virangana can also reflect on it, is when I was seeing the exhibition today was I guess because of an art historical refrain of Baudrillard and what he talks about when he's considering simulacra and simulation as modes of encounter, really. And though there is in some of his writing the idea of the prenatal, what happens in those dark spaces before you actually come into the light. And so, yes, most of your encounters, though they are also optical, they are largely oral, they are sensory, and they're sound. But he talks about the idea of simulation as something that has various models but no singular touch point. And I guess that made me think about what he was eventually getting at, which in the 80s was the idea of the hyperreal, which came about through the senses. And one of the means through which he says that can and will be communicated, and I think maybe the other exhibition on my mind is the one that was at the Whitney recently, which was on art as intelligence, different kinds of intelligence, shared intelligence. It was called Even Better Than the Real Thing, using one of the songs by U2. But effectively, it came down to man's relationship with technology. And I guess my one question to the artists was, did you ever feel, Shuddha included, that technology was not getting you to the place that you wanted to go to because of the originary, the primary, the primordial, or the very instinctive places from which your inspirations have come? What space did technology provide or not provide in this creation of work? And for Virangana, I suppose my question is about where we are today. This realm of the sonic senses is also the realm, as has been intimated, of the image and the weight images must carry today, and how images are invoked. I wanted you, I guess, Virangana, to reflect about how you have felt, or where you feel the realm of the images within the sonic, because of course that is what is triggered when you hear them.
Would any of the artists or Virangana, would you like to comment? I'll move away.
Thanks. No, it's
So
okay.
that it doesn't-
Hopefully this is okay. But in terms of where the image is invoked is something that I've been speaking about. Speaking with a lot of artists about for a while now, where it's not just the photograph as an endpoint, but how the image is something that does become an arrival and a departure through various senses. And even when it comes to language, there may be, when we start talking about just languages as form, but when language becomes an image, the way it translates, or even the way sound starts creating an image, and how memory creates this sense of a visual, whether it's personal and about how we create an output. Even when you read a book and then you watch a film, it distorts the way you may have created the image when you think about it in that sense. And when it comes to just thinking of, wait, what was the second part of your question again?
The burden
Sorry.
these
So with
must carry or do.
I think it's also where I wanted to come back to what came up when I said, most of the artists who I'm working with have very little visual. There's more of how the image is triggered in some way. And I was told, but you're a visual arts curator, which also meant that the visual is something that the audience brings in through the experience that they have, and which I think all 15 artists in some way have triggered that to expand beyond just their spaces through the sonic.
I have like primarily like a visual practice. Oh yeah, it is. Okay. And so I think like the visual side is something that I've been like working with to explore, and I think the sound and visual together and combining the two, I think for me has been like a very opens up new avenues. And I'm wondering whether I drop the visual side completely and can I communicate that only with sound. I think there are certain experiences that only require sonic like inputs, and there's certain experiences that cannot be done through sound that need visual inputs. And I don't know like what is the like I don't know, they always need to be connected, and I think they have like power on their own, but I think like the idea of exploring them together is really exciting, and how not to be too literal with sound whilst you have the visuals. And so that was my challenge when I was working on the show that's here and in the last few years, like developing that. It's like, how do I not just make a prescriptive sound, and how do I work with like these very tangible sound recordings, field recordings I made on location, which is the river flowing, of like temple bells, of like people speaking, and how do I reach like a point of how do I create something abstract for something so tangible? And because then I feel like the problem there is if you give something too tangible, people already know what that is, and you don't need to spend too much time with it. We have like, you know, experiences in life, and people experience like these sounds. So what am I offering? And I think through kind of modulating and creating I suppose that, yeah, modulating the sound, and taking away this kind of immediate recognition of what you're listening to, but also leaving a sense of like connection. So you know what you think, what you know what you're listening to, but you also don't. And leaving people in that state through like sound and visuals, I think is an interesting kind of like proposition. Yeah.
One of the things that I I'm not reading too much into it. Felt like you were suggesting that there is a main source within an artist of artistic enterprise, and does an artist or an artistic practice can it kind of locate that main source of enterprise and aesthetics? That's what I was reading into part of your comment. But I would like to actually put it to the artist. Do you, is there something, some mechanism of tapping into something which is beyond skill and technique and environment and commissions and all of that kind of stuff? I mean, of course, we all have, arguably, we all have, as creative people, somewhere that something that we tap. But when you guys create works, is there a way to retreat or locate this kind of, or is there a main source?
Sounds like you're asking a spiritual question in a very formal way. Well, I think I think that the interesting thing about kind of, let's say, the act of making is that there's a beautiful plurality of methods and ways, isn't it? And it's a bit like therapy. Sometimes it's really great to kind of talk from yourself, and other times it's great to talk from another kind of subject position, let's say. So I think actually, from my own sense, I'm definitely interested in, let's say, the history of spiritual practices, and how those have corresponded within or encoded in the histories of music and design and art and object making. So I think that, I think inevitably the foundations of artistic practice has been kind of within the confines and the histories of either kind of spirituality or kind of Western Christianity or whatever the kind of things that have been the patrons of art making. So I think actually what we're talking about is actually probably returning arts to its roots and origins, rather than the modernist tradition of the tabula rasa, of breaking from that. And so I think actually it's a really great thing now to see actually the sense of the spiritual returning to our practice, and actually thinking it's obviously related to a set of contemporary conditions that people feel potentially in need of that or safer in communicating that position. And actually, let's think about it, to be honest, like really the history of the 20th century, the early part of the 20th century, as modernism's being born, is pretty messy. It's pretty like Steiner anthroposophy, theosophy, a lot of kind of mysticism. The early Bauhaus, it's pretty mystical. It's only by the time we get to the war that creates the conditions of functionalism and very rational design language. So actually, the 20th century could have been totally artistically spiritual, and I think that's why even artists like Hilma af Klint are being now rediscovered as being a spiritual modernism. So I think actually I tap into that thing, I think, by thinking about like these alternative histories, these alternative possibilities that could have informed the present, and kind of being in a dialogue with that.
Any other questions from? Go ahead,
I actually want to also bring back what you were asking about, this kind of sleep, the moment of sleep, and also addressing what Paul has to say, because there is, when you said it and while he was talking, the image that comes to my mind, kind of being rooted in this Hindu tradition, is that of Vishnu, and this kind of myth that we are all the dream of this character. In that sense, again, going back to artists like Hilma af Klint and everything, there is an archetypal exploration that somehow, like somewhere you're tapping into that which has been, at least in recorded art history, that keeps reoccurring and reoccurring and reoccurring. So I'm quite interested in thinking about that.
I'm like desperately trying not to engage with this question because I'm trying to escape my spiritual tagline that has been in my work, and so no, I mean I'm trying to stay awake, but I'll get there. But I think there's this surveillance as an idea of like, and spirituality being like or like religion being like some sort of like surveillance mechanism, and I feel like the contemporary spiritualism is all like is all based on surveillance and like consent-based data gathering and like CCTV and all this kind of monitoring. I feel like that is the new like control mechanism, and I feel it's
institutional religion versus.
I feel like that's the contemporary version of what like some control mechanism that's in place. And I've had to shift that sort of idea of like what is happening now and what will happen in the future, and move away from this kind of traditional idea of what I like to think of as analog surveillance, which is I suppose some sense of like spirituality, and then like I call it digital surveillance. I'm making these terms up, or like more contemporary ideas of surveillance, which are like digitally kind of in place, and which are only growing, through artificial intelligence and all the systems that are in place that are monitoring us essentially.
Any other questions from?
Actually, I can just give you this, okay? Yeah. So, I'm actually thinking about touch, but also in relation to just shifting away from sound into listening, and the relationship between touch and listening. And here, say, like how you in Tibetan medicine, for instance, you touch to for a certain diagnosis to happen. So you're touching to listen for something, and that also involves a duration. you know, and so I think what I'm also thinking about is the idea of touch as a registering of something. So as opposed to touch as a modality of entering the work, but instead as a kind of extending beyond the sensation into registering of something that goes into some kind of an inscription and produces another world, a world of, you know, where something else gets revealed or unconcealed. And so I think what I'm trying to say in this very kind of roundabout way is, if one thinks about what through, and this is a very open question, in all of your work, through the various forms and expression of touch that you're using, thinking about either as a modality or sensation, what is the touch trying to listen for?
That's very interesting. I mean, like for instance, in Ayurvedic practice, the Nadi Shastra, say, you know, and the diagnosis with the pulse is reading. Is, from the little that I know, is a diagnosis based on the reading of the pulse, and the reading of the pulse is a practice, right? And so yes, and of course there's as an extension of what you're saying, it moves into, to my mind at least, into an instrumental realm, where the instrumentality of the technique opens up these possibilities, and we, the person or the patient, or we receive that knowledge in a manner. So I think that kind of relational aspect of the touch and what is heard in some sense, with the stethoscope as well. I mean, there's other kinds of course, different traditions, but I'm sure if we've set our minds to think about this question a little more, it's kind of a very provocative area. I think so. Anybody else would like to comment on that?
I think in my work, I actually wanted to explore that, how touch of different body parts make sound, and then touch of different body parts don't really necessarily mean that, you know, it have to be like visible. Like the vocal cords, you cannot really see it if you don't really go to the diagnostic level or something like that. Or the kind of sound that we make, like the rustling of leaves. So you always read in literature, but the rustling of leaves, if you record it, the sound is completely different. So it's sort of like that. I think I wanted to do it by my work. But that's a big risk I have taken now after saying it. But it touched me the way you said. I think I read it from Virangana's text. That part actually touched me, like how touch has a sound as well, this sensoriality of touch, and like the way I am moving my hands here, and this sound when we pat a cat, the sound, like you cannot really record this sound. You have to go to the sensorial level, and I think that's what I wanted to achieve by my work. Thank you for the question, actually.
What is the difference between auditory human experience and technologically enabled practices? If you look at, I'm sorry to bring it up here, contemporary practices of torture, they often involve the use of frequencies that you may not be able to hear, or may be able to hear partially, but which are deeply unsettling in a somatic and an embodied way. they will induce nausea, they will induce feelings of disorientation, they will induce, and combined incidentally with the practice of enforced sleep deprivation. So that if you are a person who's deprived of sleep and subjected to these extreme auditory phenomena, your sense of bodily and personal integrity breaks down very quickly, and it is non-invasive. It leaves no trace on your body. It is used in this country. I have had friends of mine, one friend of mine who had, unfortunately, to experience it, and he always told me that it's a very, very disturbing phenomenon. The other thing that's interesting is that it's very difficult for machines to listen. We're quite accustomed to voice recognition technologies, but it's quite an incredible feat because we are able to analyze spoken language, for instance, in a way that the phrase "in a way that" is not one word but 5. But how does that map onto a machine's ability to analyze auditory information into linguistic textual information? These are extremely difficult situations. They have been overcome to a very large extent, but still machines rely on standard accents. At the moment you speak slightly differently, machines misinterpret what you say and say other things. Also, the weird phenomena that I find fascinating of how Alexis and Siri and some of these machines, they start talking on their own or laughing in the middle of the night. Now, is that now we know that with large language models that these applications technically hallucinate. Now, are these oral hallucinations? Are these products of the surfing of auditory sensations on the internet? I don't know. So there's a lot to be done now in this frontier between what you can hear, what you can understand, and what you can't understand, but maybe can hear, and what you can't hear and can't understand. It's like the unknown unknowns.
I think the word like torture triggered something in me. So I was thinking about like this idea, like why does touch have to be like a physical like thing? It can also be psychological. Yeah. So this idea or potential of some sort of like touch, or maybe thinking of like the panopticon of this idea of being observed, whether you are or not. If you embed that sort of idea in someone's head, you are being affected by it. And so I don't really think about it in like a physical sense, but I think like touch can be kind of what's the right word, like created or embodied by like by just a proposition or an idea, or placing like a situation that something might happen, and it just in the anticipation of it, I think you could be overstimulated almost, like, you know, just like the Foucault like panopticon idea of like being in this like prison or surrounded by these windows, and you might be being observed, and how does that affect you as you like, you know, sit there or navigate, or maybe even like, especially in my context for the show that I'm showing at the moment, like there's a camera and it's observing you, and the fact that you're being observed changes the way you navigate like a space, and maybe brings some sort of accountability. But I think that is, I think, a sense of touch as well. So I was like really struggling to like when I was reading the curatorial text, I'm like, does my thing like, does it fit into it? But then like it took me a while to kind of connect them. Like, yeah, there is a kind of psychological kind of sense of touch too.
There is a very beautiful work in your show. It's called The Medium by Krishna Javeri and the Sand Dunes. I really enjoyed that because I think it's the intimacy of the touching the tabletop surface and triggering sound, and also the fact that so much of it is annotated in Braille, which sort of puts 3 types of sensory deprivation in actually contact with each other. But I have a question for all of you, because it's been bothering me while I've been here and while I'm listening to you. I mean, I can understand auditory phenomena as things that strike our ears and then get processed. But where do the sounds in our dreams come from? Because they're often things that we're not hearing. I mean, yes, the alarm clock sound might intervene in the dream process, but I've heard, I mean, we all hear people talking in our dreams, and we hear, I'm assuming we hear them, or we do something, the brain does something that is akin to what it does when it hears sound. So where are the sounds stored?
There's a very rich area of study of the cosmology of unheard sounds, imagined sounds, and of course we do have metaphysical concept of pranava, of the unstruck sound, anahata, and dream sounds and dreamscapes like visual stimuli. I mean, the amount of auditory information in dreams, as you're saying, is really spectacular. I mean, we hear every manner of things, I think, in our dreams, and I can't think of any work or to bring up in reference at the moment, but I do think it's like a absolutely fascinating area of study. Well, there was, I mean, it goes back to our notions of the study of the philosophy of consciousness itself. I remember one philosopher. He did a comparative religious studies person, comparative philosophy paper on notions of sleep and consciousness in Indian philosophical texts versus others. And one of the propositions in that paper was, how do we remember when we wake up, at the moment of waking up, how do we remember that we had slept well or not slept well in the moment of waking? We wake up and we said, oh, I had a good sleep. I didn't have a good sleep. How do we recall that? What is the mechanism? Where is that memory stored and how are we able to recall it? Similarly, I think auditory information, and that's where auditory illusions, especially related to sleep, also come up. There is, in some sense, in a literary sense, a store of things that we hear. And the question is, of course, which is it's really provocative thought. What is it that we're hearing and what is it that's stored there?
Let me amplify this question. There's this weird radio station called, it's 4,625 kilohertz. It's a shortwave radio station. You tune into it, you hear a voice that's just reading numbers in Russian. Now, I've heard it, but I've had dreams in which I've heard that voice reading the numbers in English, which I haven't heard. So I've been trying to figure this out. Where does this come from?
It's fascinating.
I think there's like a realm of like identified sounds that we know what they are, and there's a world of like unidentified sounds. So there's this archive of like unidentified sounds that scientists can't figure out like what these sounds are, and they're largely like recorded in space. And I think that sort of context of like, I don't know what like the sound, I don't know what I hear when I'm sleeping, because I think that I'm an on-off switch these days, so I can't recollect what the sounds in my dreams are. But I think the curiosity of like trying to understand what this sound is kind of, yeah. I mean, just thinking about that is keeping me awake. So,
Sorry, I'd like to continue this conversation a little bit longer. I was once asked this question, what language do I think in? And I found that quite interesting, to think about what's the language of my thought. Do I think in Gujarati, which is my mother tongue, or do I think in English? And when there is after I was asked that question, I also started to observe that when I'm reading, it's auditory in my head, right? So there is a sound of your thoughts, or a language of your thoughts. And I wonder if that's what's translating the Russian numbers into English. But that's also kind of something that I'm exploring with this work, because in 13 Post Office Lane, because the voice is the same voice, making different voices. So it's the same voice that's becoming the voice of the grandmother or the mother or the boy or his friends, or all of those characters are voiced by the same voice, which is perhaps the voice in your head or the voice of your thoughts. Really.
Thank you. I think we're out of time and we have to wrap this up, but many thanks to all of you. Virangana, many thanks, and congratulations again to all of you. Very nice.
I need a group picture. Can everyone please stand and come closer?